Over the past, few years, Americans have been learning about our pronouns. On many a Zoom screen now, as we all wear name tags, on many an email signature at business conferences, sometimes at first gatherings of new friends, it is now normal to see or to hear parenthetical expressions of what gendered pronoun we use as a matter of address. This would have been unthinkable 10 or 20 years ago. Because 10 or 20 years ago, there were only two pronouns, the masculine one, then the feminine one. But now we have this purposely troublesome they in the singular. And some people now take more than one pronoun. What would have been unthinkable when I was growing up is now not only thinkable, but imaginable, invitational, and liberating to many, many people, me included. For some, the inclusion of the pronominal instructions are a matter of hospitality, helping the reader to know their audience, or to know their author, and to name their author as the author wants to be known. For others, these parentheticals are matters of safety from the violence that comes from misgendering, from sexism, from misogyny, from genderphobia. And for still others, these parentheticals are political defiance. They are a need to express individuality and a refusal to accept societal norms. While for still others, it's the simple matter of allyship. There are certainly more reasons, but I imagine that many of these reasons boil down to something so much more simple. Simply this: we humans want to be seen and to be known for who and what we are. This is in our biological makeup. If we are not seen, we shrivel. If a baby is neglected, unseen, unheard, or unheeded by its caregivers, it dies psychically and in some extreme cases will die physically. These small parenthetical expressions, now so common, are thus expressions of life and of the life force, and of wanting to live and be named as God first created us to live, named us, and called us for the first time in all creation, not just good, but very good. These parentheticals, however, are not trouble-free. For some, they may represent signs of wokeism, and the backstory to legislation about bathrooms, whether or not our teachers can say the word gay, and how we talk about gender and sexuality with our young people, to say nothing about how we talk about it with ourselves. For others, it poses a quandary about who gets to claim what pronoun, or even what gender. And we run into questions of what makes a man, and linguistic distinctions between a category of women and people who menstruate. Now again, there are many, many troubles this pronoun awakening has to us, and it has brought this to our awareness. And these are new troubles for us, for some of us, and I'm here for it. But one of the things we, people of a book, should consider is that linguistic, grammatical trouble, this linguistic and grammatical trouble that we find ourselves in today, the singular they, and the both end of people who are happy to use more than one pronoun. This is not new. Now in English, we do not decline the gender of nouns to match our verbs, and we don't conjugate the gender of verbs to match our nouns. This is not the case, as many of you know, with Romance languages. And our grammar has long been used as a tool of the gender police and of those who prefer to think of the world in binaries, heteronormativity and monogamy. Now I realize the sentence I just said has about 12 sermons in it, so stick with me. We're just talking about grammar and expressions of gender for the moment. And one of my favorite historical periods, as any of you who has had a glass of wine with me know, is the beginning of the Middle Ages. In this period, and in church history in this period, Christianity is starting to spread through Northern Europe. After 1054, when the Roman and the Eastern churches split, Christian zealotness takes on a new form, and it starts moving northward. It's a strategic push by Rome, and one of the ways they do this is by language and narrative technique, where they don't just, this is what's so great, they don't just erase the pagan stories at this time, they start adding to them. They co-opt them, and they do it more gradually. Two particular methods that are employed. First, the Christian cast of characters, our Jesus and Joseph and Mary and all the 12 and everybody else, they don't appear as a standalone cast right at the beginning in Northern Europe. They start appearing as extras or special guest stars in the more familiar and longer running stories that have been going on for centuries. You'll find in this era literature where Christian gods and Christian characters start appearing right alongside the pagan gods and goddesses, in the same stories, in the same artwork. Secondly, and this is slightly even more devious for any of you who are writers, the pagan gods and goddesses start speaking differently, even in their own stories. They start talking about things that they never talked about before, things that they were never concerned with. They start speaking Christian, quote-unquote, Christian values. And if you think that contemporary Christianity, perhaps fundamentalist contemporary Christianity, talks too much about sex, or that the church should get out of your bedroom or marriage license department or school bathroom, know that you're not alone. The church has been using bedroom and bathroom politics to suppress human gender and sexuality for at least these past 1,000 years. And one of my favorite poems from this era that gives our contemporary discussion some history is a 12th century Latin text, probably written by a cleric. The French church at this time, the Gallic church, is instrumental in bridging Rome to the north. There's a cleric, and he writes this poem called The Trial of Ganymede. Sometimes it's known as the debate between Ganymede and Helen. Now, Ganymede, as many of you know, was the most famous of Zeus's male lovers. In the pantheon, this posed no problems. In Christianity's aims, it poses many problems. Now, for centuries, many faithful, wonderful, Mediterranean diet-eating people around the sea to the south had no problems with Ganymede's relationship with Zeus. Nor, most notably, did any of Zeus's female lovers. Suddenly, however, here in the middle of the 12th century, in what is becoming Northern Europe, there's an objection. Helen, the most beautiful woman of all the earth. You know her. Helen takes objection to Ganymede's love with Zeus and brings him to court. And in this poem, she says to him, men cannot love men, men must love women. And the two debate. Surrounded by the heavenly court, all the gods and goddesses are there. This was the best must-see TV of its time. Helen would have never talked about this before the 12th century. She didn't care. She was the most beautiful woman on all the earth. So what if Zeus didn't want her? She could have any man she wanted. Ganymede, because this is the spread of Christianity, ultimately loses the debate. But before he loses, I'm going to get back to that in a moment, but before he loses, this is hard for me to get this into a paragraph because I could talk about this for days. Before he loses, he makes one of the most famous grammatical expressions in defense of sexual diversity and gender nonconformity. He makes this beautiful expression that is baked into grammar. And he says, in grammar, in Latin, like sick with sick, all things must go, sick being he. Like he with he, all things must go. The defense of homosexuality in the 12th century in Latin courses was, if it's a male noun, it has to be a male verb. If it's a female noun, it has to be a female verb. And grammar was king or queen. So this was the excuse. The whole court gasps. We think that Ganymede has won. Helen comes in and it's her beauty. She coaxes them all up, that siren. But she ultimately wins. And in the end of the debate, not only does Ganymede succeed, but in one of the first recorded instances of conversion therapy, he proposes to Helen by the end of this here poem, which is a rather striking new invention in the history of this ancient tale. He nearly wins, though, and he nearly wins on grammar alone. The pronoun problems we're having now, they go back thousands of years. But in that same poem, Here Come the Christian Values, Helen cites creation, and she speaks of the Creator creating man and woman. And today, many people still talk about God creating two genders, and the alleged creating of two genders is used to justify any number of atrocities committed in the purported name of God to people who disagree. We all know what biblical marriage is code for. And over the past decade, America has gotten better with quote-unquote gay marriage, a marriage that I will tell you, and pretty much all of us who are in one will tell you, is exactly as exciting, boring, wonderful, tedious, joy-filled, infuriating, and exasperating, and loving as any other marriage. Marriage equality, that's what we wanted. We got it. The battle for marriage equality was long fought and is not without its trouble. It is in many ways an awakening that sexual diversity was and is part of God's immense imagination for creation. Now, we're not there yet with gender expressions, but I think we're at the start of a movement. I think these parentheses are little things that indicate something is adrift. And speaking of the start, let's look at the start, at the two stories of creation Lynn just read for us moments ago. In the first account, in the book we now commonly call Genesis 1, is the story of a 7-day act of creation, on the seventh of which God rests, and on the sixth, which we heard today, God creates humankind. Genesis 1 is a strand of the ancient story that you know is two strands woven together by the ancient Hebrews to create a unified story that we now have. If you know anything about the Old Testament, you know that there's a J strand, a Yahweh strand, and a P strand, a priestly strand, two different versions of the same stories that the ancient Hebrews, when they started writing these oral traditions down, stitched together into the ordering of texts that we now have. And you know that what we call the Old Testament, there are many times when the narrative seems to stop, repeat itself, kind of like a bad game of telephone where it doesn't quite get all the details right, but tells you something else new, and then it stops again and goes back to the first story you were listening to. This first and second chapters of the book of Genesis are a good example of this exact sort of stopping and starting of the same story being told twice. In the first chapter, Scripture tells that God created humankind in God's own image, and that male and female God created them. Scripture does not tell us that God created men and women, which would be nouns. Scripture tells us that male and female, adjectives, God created them. Way back in the beginning of time, God created human beings in God's image. God, who is all things, God, who is Godhead of the divine court, God, whose preferred pronoun is God, but in a pinch will take they, them, or theirs, God created humans similarly, which is to say that in each of us, God placed elements of masculine and feminine. That gender wasn't binary. That on that sixth day of creation, in the Genesis 1 account, God created a singular human who was both male and female. Now, I dare say many conservative readings, strict constructionists, as we might call them, would disagree with me. But the text says what it says. It's just not a clear-cut men and women. It's male and female that God created them. But clearly, our modern-day fundamentalists are not alone. The writers of Genesis 2 must have been equally concerned about this singular human being who was both male and female, for they tell a different story, don't they? In that story, in Genesis 2, it begins. On the same day that God created the heavens and the earth, God created humankind in God's own image. And it goes on to tell the story of God making that first human fall asleep. And while Adam slept, God removed the feminine from him and created Eve. Commonly, and in most Bibles, probably in the ones that are in your pews, Bibles now have chapter headings. They're like cliff notes for those of us who can't actually understand the text themselves. Some invention of the 20th century said, these people need some headers. And so we have these expansions, we have these heading titles, and oftentimes Genesis 2, the way that theologians justify this entirely different expression of creation, is by calling Genesis 2 an expansion of the sixth day. So we think of what's happening in Genesis 2, theologians do, as an expansion of what happened on that sixth day. Except that the text doesn't really work like that, because Genesis 2 begins on the same day that God created the heavens and the earth, which is not day 6, according to Genesis 1. Well, we're in trouble right there, but we don't care, we just go right on. Genesis 2's account is very different. And just as the four Gospels are complete works of revelation unto themselves, that they stand alone as full revelation, and yet, when we look at the four Gospels together, we see a fuller picture of Revelation, so too are these ancient J and P strands. Long before these two different stories were redacted and edited together, Genesis 1, with its sixth day of creation, and a human singular they, was complete. And it was separate from Genesis 2 with its need to create two different human genders as partners for one another. Now, for centuries, Genesis 2 has been used as scriptural reference by the gender police, the marriage police, the sexuality police, and pretty much anyone else who feels threatened by two women holding hands, or a man in a dress, or someone with a they, their, them pronoun. But even if we hold to Genesis 2, and it's scripture, so let's stick with it, let's pay close attention to the order of operations of God's creation here. 1, there is a human that God created. And for our simplicity here, we'll call that human Adam. And then from that Adam, step 2, God makes Adam fall asleep. As is always advisable when about to undergo life-changing surgery, Adam falls into a deep sleep. Step 3. While Adam sleeps, God extracts a rib. But this isn't just a common rib, any old rib. It's the rib that contains the mysteries of the feminine, the wonders, the joy, the laughter, the caretaking, the loving, the gentle, the complex, the brilliant, the wise. God extracts this rib of feminine energy and makeup and places it into a new second human who is now called a woman. And with that rib, let's imagine that it didn't just come with the sense of the masculine that it once had. It came with memory. It had sense memory. That rib did know something about the masculine that it came with. It came with little sinews and bloody bits on the sides that maybe carried some DNA coding. The woman, the second human, was created out of the first human, but let's imagine that the first human had some scar tissue, maybe some memory loss, a ghost limb, something that said, there used to be something more, what is it? I miss it. And let's imagine that the second human said, I am woman, but there's something that isn't quite right. There is this masculine part of me that I can't quite put my name on. Putting this in pronoun terms, God, they, their, them, first created humankind as a they. And then God removed a huge piece of that they. And in that moment, they became a he. And out of they, God created a she. From God, whom we are created in the image of, we were created as they, and then separated. From that first he and she, all of us come. So says the story. But all of us come with these same mixed up and commingled and messy bits of creation, And the remixing that is DNA and breeding and all the genetic traits that come through, the successive ones, the minor ones, the ones that get carried and picked up, and the ones that need to be expressed in other ways. This leaves us this strange, muddy, wondered, gendered, complex mix-up that actually goes way back to the start, that is far more true and far more complicated than gender or gendered language. It goes to who we are and to who God is. Male and female, we were each created. We're at the beginning of relearning this. The parentheticals we use, the names we call each other, the awakenings we are having tell us how far we have to go. And isn't it wonderful that this is something that us older folk are learning from the younger folk as much as we don't want to? Look what this new generation is teaching us. Non-binary people know this. Trans people know this. Gender non-conforming people know this. And we're asking the world to listen to us in a new way. There is something that is coming out of this pronoun moment that points us to the creation that God made. Here at the beginning of Women's History Month, we honor the legacy and the history of what women do and know and share. And for the rest of this month, this pulpit will be filled with a really wonderful cast of guest preachers, all women. And what we know is that history is the story of all humankind. Her story is the story of all humankind. Maybe their story is the story of each humankind. In getting more and more uncomfortable in our historic representations of gender, maybe we can begin getting to more and more comfortable with some of the new things we're learning. With the singular they, which I'm a writer, I've resisted, I hated it. I'm getting on board with it. Yes, it's true. And it's actually liberating. There's so many parts of this, of what it means to not have to be the best little girl or the best little boy doing all of what good little girls do and all of what little boys do and following all these gendered norms that come out of 20th century American Protestantism, that come out of late Victorian how to children should be seen and not heard, that come out of the Enlightenment before that, that come out of the Renaissance, that come out of these Middle Ages, that had every bit as much trouble with this as we do now, that come out of the garden, the ancient operating room where God first created each humankind, then separated it, and we've been trying to get it back together ever since. There is such a moment. And here at the start of Women's History Month, when I, as a male-bodied person, stand here, and don't cede this pulpit, your pulpit this day, but come to tell you that there is something far more something far more transgressive than what any of us have known and held on to. That we can move to look for the feminine in each of ourselves, the masculine in each of ourselves, and to move as and how we are created to wake up to that sixth day of creation, which is also the first day of creation, which is also today when we name ourselves. Parentheses, at a cocktail party at a conference, on a name tag, maybe even in coffee hour today. Gender is a gift of God. It is given freely and equally to all, dosed out in a strange proportion of male and female. No one's 0 or 100 on either one of those percentages, but is created as each of us are created unique individuals, each created in the image of God, and each named very, very good.